Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Karen Basarab, and I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And I'm excited to welcome you all to our webinar today, Shaping Policy for a Shifting Climate, the Role of Food Policy Councils. We are hosting this webinar today to talk about the relationship between climate change and our food system, along with what food policy councils can do to address climate change in their communities. Before we proceed, though, given that we're talking about climate change and some about kind of natural disasters, I wanted to observe just a moment of silence to remember the people who have lost their lives during Hurricane Helene recently, and to honor the emergency responders who stare down nature to help people during natural disasters. As we have witnessed with the recent hurricanes, Helene and Milton, along with wildfires in the West, in Montana and Wyoming, natural disasters are increasing in intensity and in frequency. And while these disasters have significant impact on the lives of families, their homes, the built environment, and their towns, they also have significant impact on our food system. In the High Plains region, wildfires have killed thousands of cattle and burned up acres of hay needed to feed cattle that did survive. Hurricane Helene washed away fields of crops ready for harvest in Western North Carolina. Climate change is an important consideration for food policy councils that are trying to build and support food systems that nourish all people, and while not depleting or harming our natural resources. During our time today, you will hear about what food policy councils and similar groups can do to address climate change. Our webinar today is being hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future's Food Policy Networks Project. Sorry, that's a mouthful. The Food Policy Networks Project provided technical assistance, training, support, resource development, and connections to over 300 food policy councils across the US, along with allied organizations and others involved in food systems policy change. To uplift the work of food policy councils to address climate change and raise awareness about our food system, and its impacts of climate change, we've created a guide called Shaping Policy for a Shifting Climate, the Role of Food Policy Councils. I would like to take a moment to recognize Ali Weiner for their work in creating this guide. Sprint for clapping. This webinar today is framed around this new resource and will feature some of the examples from the guide. As we know, there's a lot of work happening in communities to address climate change, definitely more than we've captured in this single resource or guide. So as we settle into our presentations today, we'd like to hear from you about what is your food policy council or organization doing to address climate change. And if you would take a moment to use the chat to share with us what it is you're doing in your communities to address climate change. Also, please introduce yourself. We'd love to know who's joining us in the webinar. Tell us where you're from, where you're calling in from or joining us from, and who you are. So our agenda today begins with presentations from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future staff that provide a macro or big picture overview of the relationship between our larger food system and climate change, followed by a presentation that narrows in on our individual role and our habits in climate change through diets and eating habits. After that, we'll move up to the community or regional scale to hear examples from 3 food policy councils about their efforts to address climate change through their work in their communities. Lastly, we'll wrap up with time for questions. As we move through the presentations, please be sure to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for the presenters. So today, our presenters include 5 individuals. We have Brent Kim, who's a program officer with the Center for a Livable Future. Brent earned his master's in global disease epidemiology from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he now serves as a faculty scientist. His research spans farm to fork, with published works on sustainable diets, climate change, industrial food and animal production, and chemical exposures. Next, we have Becky Ramsing, who is a senior program officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Becky is primarily responsible for managing the center's science advisory role with the Meatless Monday campaign, and she oversees research, communication, evaluation, and programming that facilitates a shift to sustainable and healthy diets. Before I move on, I especially want to recognize the folks, three of our presenters that are here today who've recently been facing natural disasters in their area, including those coming from Pasco County, Florida, and from Montana. Del Deschamps is the chair and founding member of the Pasco County Food Policy Council in Florida. He is an instructor emeritus in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of South Florida. He is also a prolific writer who specializes in religion and contemporary cultures. Del is joined today by Kristen King. Del and Kristen will be talking about how the Pasco Food Policy Council was able to get food and agriculture recognized in the Tampa Bay Regional Resilient Action Plan. Next is Jenny Zazo Hitchcock, who is a Communications and Development Director for Farm Connect Montana. She's a founding member and currently serves on the Missoula City County Food Advisory Board, which was established in 2021. And she also has a background in nonprofit leadership, food systems, and conservation. Jenny will be sharing about their work between a government nonprofit partnership effort to conserve land for sustainable agriculture. And last, we have Maddie Shera, who is the director of the Greater Cincinnati Regional Food Policy Council that spans Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Maddie leads the council's efforts at collaborative impact toward a resilient regional food system. Maddie holds a PhD in anthropology with a focus on food, the environment, and culture. Today, she'll be sharing with us about how the regional council has made climate change a priority and how they're engaging at a federal level to ensure that climate change is represented and present in the Farm Bill. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon and sharing your wisdom, knowledge, and experience. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brent Kim, who's going to kind of provide a framework or overview of the relationship between climate change and our food system.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. And thanks to all of you for having me as your guest. So you wouldn't all be here if you didn't already recognize that climate change is among the greatest public health, ecological, and economic threats to both current and future generations. What I'd like you to walk away from this presentation with are answers to two questions. And the first one is, what are the relationships among food, agriculture, and the climate crisis? And secondly, how can food policy councils leverage these relationships to cultivate a more healthy, equitable, sustainable, and resilient food system? So my 10 minutes is mostly going to be focused on the first question, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and then three of you who will be answering the second question. So farmer, poet, and author Wendell Berry, shown here with his dog, famously wrote that how we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. The food system is a leading driver, or actually the leading driver of how we use our land, of freshwater use, and it's among the leading drivers of the climate crisis. My one critique of my slide here, well, one, that it's very evident that I grew up in the 70s and 80s because I'm using Pac-Man as iconography for eating. If anyone's familiar, it's a video game from the 70s and 80s. It's a yellow character with a mouth that eats dots. So I'm using that as shorthand for how we eat. My other critique of my slide here is that, we're kind of putting all the blame on the eaters here. And I don't think Wendell Berry intended that with his quote. So, right, because we don't make food choices in a vacuum, we make them in the context of societal pressures and social norms and the policies that shape what's affordable to us and what's accessible to us. So I'm going to change how we eat to better acknowledge what we call the food environment. It's the environment in which we make our food choices. And my colleague Becky is going to talk about that in her talk, because of course, it's not just the eater that's responsible for these burdens upon the planet. It's a lot more complicated than that. So for my presentation, just as shorthand, I'm going to use the term food systems to represent the people and the activity and the resources and the policies that are involved from farm to fork that shape the impact of the food system on our planet. And I'm mainly going to be focusing on the greenhouse gas emissions that are released from farm to fork that are contributing to the climate change. So the food system is responsible for an estimated approximately 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions that are driving the climate crisis. And we can look at a breakdown of where those emissions are coming from. Let me take a sip of water here. So, different studies, you might see a slightly different version of this pie chart. They may break it down differently depending on different assumptions or different data sources. But key points here, I'm going to start with the biggest wedge in the top right, and that's LUC is short for land use change. And in the context of the food system, that's what we're talking about, usually deforestation, and that's predominantly for grazing lands, right? So trees are predominantly made of carbon. So when you're clearing those forests, you're releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. The second wedge at the bottom is agricultural production. So for terrestrial production, that's crop fields, that's animals. For aquaculture, that's fish farming. It's also catching fish from the wild. Key point here is that the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions from the food system are from the food that we produce and how we produce it, with the other sectors representing a much smaller share, right? We can go over to transportation. It's a pretty small slice within the food system as a whole. And that's important because I think we tend to put a lot of attention on food miles as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are many, many important and good reasons to eat locally, but food miles and greenhouse gas emissions aren't necessarily the main reason why there's value in eating locally. In fact, there was one study that came out that estimated that for the typical American, if they were to eat a plant-based diet for just 1 day per week, that would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions more than eating locally for all 7 days of the week. Just to kind of put that in context. Similarly, with food processing, right, there are a lot of good health-based reasons to avoid highly processed foods, but climate change isn't necessarily a main reason why we would be worried about processing. And then finally, going over and just skipping a few steps here, going to end of life, that represents predominantly methane emissions from food that's decomposing in landfills. And that's one of the reasons why reducing food waste is so important. Another thing I want to point out here is that most of these emissions coming from food are not carbon dioxide. We put a lot of emphasis on carbon dioxide, and rightly so, because globally it's a major driver of climate change. But within the context of the food system, most of these emissions are actually coming from methane and nitrous oxide, two very potent greenhouse gas emissions that come from sources like cattle burps or decomposing manure or synthetic fertilizers. So that's to give you some context of where these emissions are coming from. But what do they mean in terms of avoiding catastrophic climate change? So global leaders and scientists have agreed that to avoid the most catastrophic climate scenarios, we have to cap global average temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. And ideally, we would cap it at 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial era. Unsurprisingly, you all probably know this, we're not doing well in that regard. The plot on the left shows temperature rise over the past couple decades. And as of November 2023, we had already hit 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming. So we're well on our way to both meeting and even exceeding those climate change mitigation targets. And then when we talk about the role of food and agriculture in all of this, this is a paper from 2023 that, based on different projections and population growth, from food alone, we're not even counting fossil fuels or anything else, just from food and agriculture alone, we're looking at as much as 0.9 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. That's a problem because we've already hit 1.3, and if we add 0.9 on top of that, we've vastly exceeded all those climate mitigation targets. So food and agriculture may not be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, but if we don't curb those emissions, we will very likely exceed those thresholds. And what's sobering is, the majority of warming in these different population growth scenarios were attributable to meat and dairy. That's probably not surprising. Those are some of the more greenhouse gas intensive foods to produce. What's even more sobering is that this study assumed that meat and dairy intake are held constant. So all the warming that we're seeing in this scenario is solely because there are more people. This study didn't even account for or they were aware of it, but it's a conservative estimate because globally projected in meat and dairy intake is projected to increase by 70%. So these numbers should be seen as an underestimate. So what can we do about this? This is very sobering. So we're talking about we use the term mitigation, climate change mitigation, to efforts that reduce our releases of greenhouse gas emissions and reducing the impact of climate change. So that could mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions by changing what we eat, changing what we farm, changing how we farm, and reducing food waste. It could also mean actually taking greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere through something called sequestration, where we're taking carbon and storing it in plant biomass. That could be biomass in plant roots in the soil. It could also mean reforestation and storing it in trees. So to give you a couple options of mitigation pathways, so these are cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from the food system shown in the black bar. What's most important to take away here is that this red dashed line, that's the threshold that we have to stay below to have at least a 67% probability of avoiding those most catastrophic climate change scenarios. And the greenhouse gas emissions from food and food alone, again, fossil fuels aren't even in the picture here, just food is eating up almost that entire budget with no room for any of the other sectors. Now, this paper modeled some potential alternate future scenarios where we all shift to plant-rich diets, something called the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet. It's not exclusively vegan. No one is saying we need to eliminate animal foods, and there are important roles for animals in a sustainable food future, but there is an urgency to cut back among countries that are over-consuming animal food. So a shift to plant-rich diets could roughly halve those greenhouse gas emissions. And then in addition to that, we need to see increases in agricultural yields, reductions in food wastes. High efficiency refers to technological adaptations that reduce the greenhouse gas intensities of production, like feeding seaweed to cows to reduce methane emissions. I have some caveats and concerns about some of those interventions, but that's a side point. And then this last bar shows that what happens if we do, if we go halfway on all of those interventions together. So this is a point that's been made dozens of times over and over again in different papers in different ways, that in order to avoid the most catastrophic climate change scenarios, we need three things: a shift toward plant-based diets, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and we need to reduce food waste. So we see that again and again. Importantly, when we're talking about changing diets, we're focusing on the countries that are among the top 10 per capita meat-consuming countries, shown in red. Briefly, I want to point out, going back to our diagram here, this relationships in food system and climate, it's a two-way street, right? So what we eat contributes to climate change, but climate change also disrupts our food systems through droughts, flooding, and changes to crop physiology. Some crops will become less nutritious with less protein, less zinc, less iron. Other crops, such as rice, have been shown to take up more arsenic, a cancer-causing chemical, through changes in soil microbiome. So there's a whole host of downstream impacts. Adaptation and resilience refers to the work that we need to do to make the food system better prepared and to be able to bounce back from these kinds of impacts. That means diversifying our food system, so we're not just over-reliant on one single monoculture. And just as one of many examples, it could mean something like agroforestry, where you're planting trees alongside crops, or you're growing trees alongside grazing animals. And those trees can provide benefits like reducing soil erosion, providing a wind buffer in the case of storms, and making nutrients more available to crops. So big picture, we talked about a lot of verbs here. Climate change mitigation, which could mean reducing emissions or sequestration. We also need adaptation. We need to build resilience, and we can do that through changing diets, reducing waste, changing farming, and the amazing work that you are doing to change policy. So with that, I'm going to stop and pass it over to my colleague, Becky Ramsey.
Hi, thanks, Brent. It's always really helpful to follow Brent because he lays it out so well. So really happy to be here, and also really excited about hearing all that you are doing at the next part of this webinar. So I'm going to start, you can advance, with this assumption here that Brent beautifully laid out, that what we eat really matters for climate change. As reflected in a recent study, it was estimated that adopting plant-rich diets globally could keep emissions under that 1.5 degree threshold that Brent talked about. So how do we do that? And I've talked a little bit about some other benefits as well. So if you can, next slide. I have to advance my slides as well, sorry. More plants we know is great for the planet, also good for our health, which is probably no surprise to many of you who work in the food system and work in the food world. It's hard to draw the line directly to meat when it becomes a health, but meat plays a major role. A summary of studies support evidence that diets low in red and processed meats replaced by different foods lower the risk of diabetes, heart disease, some cancers, and total mortality, as we would call it. On the other side, there's compelling evidence that consuming a diet that has very rich in fruits, vegetables, dietary fiber like whole grains, legumes, and nuts also prevent chronic diseases and also have strong links to like gut health, kidney health, and healthier weights, as well as these other diseases I mentioned. Next slide. Like, this is my complicated slide, and I think I'm gonna walk you through this. It shouldn't be too hard. So in a recent study, authors looked at data related to specific food groups and associated human health and environmental impacts. The left side, this side that you see, is a circle diagram. It's called a radar plot that shows the health impacts on one side, like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and on the right side are some of the environmental impacts, like water use, water pollution, land use, and greenhouse gas emissions. Click the next one. Okay, now here you see are these radar plots of the health and environmental impacts and kind of that same circle of the different food groups that we would look at. In this radar plot, the lower, the small, if the dot is on the inside of the circle, that means a lower impact. If the dot is on the outside of the circle, it means a higher impact. And so we want lower impact on all these areas. So you can see there, the first, you can click, Karen, you can see the first two, the red meat and processed meat are really high. So that's pretty clear that they have high environmental impacts and high health impacts. You can click again. And then some of these foods here you see up here have smaller circles. Generally, these are legumes, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, and show that they have lower impacts on most of those areas. And then there's some that are a little bit of a mixed bag, like dairy, where as you can see, health-wise are very good, have lower impacts, but environmentally have a big impact. Seafood to some extent, the same story. And then we have like sugar sweetened beverages, which it's okay, you can go. Sugar sweetened beverages, which environmentally look okay, but health wise very badly. So there's some nuance in how we talk about diets. But it's pretty clear, as you can see, that red meat and processed meat really are some of the biggest things biggest food groups most important food groups to focus on. It appears that why are we picking on red meat is, appears that research is it's saturated fat and cholesterol, but could also be other things like its impact on our gut health. It could be heme iron that you may have heard of that is higher in red meat and is associated with some chronic diseases, or the overall dietary pattern that I talked about, that people who eat red meat may also be eating more sugars, oils, sodiums, fewer whole grains, vegetables, and fiber. So but we do know that processed meat really has the strongest evidence base for adverse health outcomes. And in terms of in terms of our diet in the United States, we do, there's some talk about we need this for protein. Well, we actually do eat more protein generally than we need to, and we're still eating more than the dietary guideline recommendations for red meat, and we have fewer whole grains, vegetables, and fruits than advised by our dietary guidelines. This next slide here you see just shows that, just pointing out that, yes, we need to shift, but these smaller changes are also important. I think this is where you, and working in the Food Policy Council world and working with, with consumers and a community, can really have this message of these incremental changes do matter. This is a study in the UK that looked at they classified consumers and how they eat, eaters by high meat eaters, medium meat eaters, all the way down to vegans. And they show that just those incremental changes actually compared to higher meat eaters, lower the impact on carbon, on CO2 or, greenhouse gas emissions, land and water, and others as well. Next slide. I also just want to look, we hear a lot of these terms, and I thought I'd just throw this in here. There's a lot of ways to look at dietary patterns, and you hear a lot about plant-based and like, what are those? They're a little bit confusing. And I think this diagram is really good in kind of showing where they overlap and where they're separate. Generally, plant-based diets are ones that are lower in meat and heavier in plants. One researcher I work with defines them as when a plant-based diet is when more than 50% of your protein foods come from plants. Then you might have the vegan diets, which are no animal products at all, or the vegetarian, which has dairy products but no meat products, or some of these called semi-vegetarians, which where you pick, they may eat one type of animal protein like seafood or chicken, poultry. So just remember that there are a lot of ways to describe diets, and but the stepwise transition and helping people kind of in the spectrum is also good to remember that you don't have to go all the way, but there are different ways you can get to eating a more healthy, sustainable diet. Next slide. Actually, you can skip ahead. So how do we get there? What do we eat? And I think the first step toward a climate healthy diet is, what I talked about, and Brent talked about as well, is just shifting our protein, reducing the consumption of animal protein, like particularly red and processed meats, but also just really trying to, replace them with healthy vegetable proteins, moderate portions of dairy. And when you do eat animal proteins, try to just really focus on sustainable sources of those proteins. Next slide. Second principle is really consuming more fruits and more foods that come from plants, particularly healthy plant sources. So, less meat's great, but you need to have a healthy overall diet. And so just more whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and nuts, and purchasing, produce and local produce in season, and just really diversity and variety. So there's a lot of ways to get to it. But really important, really looking at both sides of the spectrum of the diet, I guess, is the best way to say it. And then I guess we have to really acknowledge the human part of ourselves is really important as we talk to people about diets and what they eat. Health in and of itself is complex and has many influencing factors. Healthcare, lifestyle behaviors like smoking, diet, alcohol, exercise, where people live, and their socioeconomic situation all influence health. We often call these social determinants of health. So our best success of eating healthy and helping people choose these foods is really acknowledging this whole person and all these areas of why a person makes a food choice and how they eat. Next slide. Sticking with this kind of human side, I'm gonna dive in a little bit of some surveys we've done around how people and whether or not they choose to reduce meat or not. These are people who don't reduce meat, and you can see the most reason that they don't reduce meat here is that they believe meat is needed for a health, and a complete diet is really, you need to have meat in a complete meal for meat. On the other hand, when people do reduce meat, next slide, it's a lot of it is really health focused as well. Even though there's a lot of great, just hearing this talk even so far today, you might be compelled by climate and environment, but most people will choose to eat less meat because of how they feel, because of their health, because of their personal, how it affects them personally. So just remember as we approach this to really have the different approaches is okay. We're getting to the same place in the end. Next slide. The other thing I think is important to remember is how people make changes. This is from a survey we did where doesn't really show super well on this slide, a little busy, but we did the survey, and about over half of people said that in the last year they reduced some kind of animal protein like meat, poultry, or fish. But the way they did it was very different. About 30% of them cut meat out one day a week. 43% took it from one meal, eliminated one meal of the day. 56% ate smaller portions, and 66% just bought less meat when they went to the store. But only about 8% say they cut that meat out completely. So the stepwise changes are really important to acknowledge. Next step. You heard that we spent a lot of time with Meatless Monday at our center, and Meatless Monday is a good example here that these small changes may not look like a lot, but when more people do them, when more people participate, you have a bigger impact, and that's where this work in communities is so important. We did some back of the napkin calculations and showed that if someone just Meatless Monday is not eating meat one day a week, one very small change, but people. If you can 30% of the Americans to not eat meat one day a week, it's the same impact as all the vegetarians and vegans in the United States now. And getting 50%, you can even get a bigger impact. And that's that's equivalent to taking about 3 million cars off the road. So that's a pretty big impact if you think about that. Next slide. You can skip that one. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to get there. Here's another little more complicated slide, but the rest of them I promise will be shorter. But you can, getting consumers to make changes. You can look at education, awareness, changing the food environment we talked about. This diagram shows how these may work together. On the right, you see the blue boxes, our values, beliefs, intentions, make up what we call a reflective system, things we think about how we want to eat. They're influenced by education, culture, beliefs, and values. And then on the left, that red box is what we call our automatic system. And this is kind of what we actually do. It's driven by the food environment around us, what's in the grocery store, what other people are eating, what our family is eating, these cues, and some of our pre-existing associations, our tastes and things that we like. So I may have the best intention to make a healthy choice or a meatless choice in this case, but when it comes down to it and I'm in a room and everyone else is choosing a hamburger and they smell really good, that is going to make me I'm going to choose that hamburger because that's my automatic system. So a lot of working with the food environment and working in these is really making these choices easier. How do we make the right choice easier by changing the food environment, making things more affordable and accessible is a really good way to think about education campaigns and awareness and such. Next slide. So we have a lot of experts on this call, and you can add a lot more here, but I have a few points of how you mentioned municipalities, food policy councils can impact the food environment, help our communities make more healthy, sustainable food choices and improve our food environments. These are just some ideas I wrote down. You'll have the slides where you can spend more time on them, but some of them are just really focusing on procurement policies that support plant-based foods in public facilities. Some cities have made proclamations like a Meatless Monday proclamation just to really solidify their commitment to this. Supporting this transformed food environment, addressing food loss and waste is also big. Supporting urban agriculture that's regenerative and using better practices, and just really including the food system in our climate action plans. Next. Okay, good. And then I'm going to skip. I'm going to show you this. You can come back to this. The C40 is a great resource. These cities, they set measures that cities can adopt to support healthier food systems. The link is there for you. Next, I have what food policy councils can do, just really supporting you. And this is where we're going to spend the rest of the time. So I'm not going to spend much time here, but just really supporting policies that increase access to fresh vegetables and healthy foods, advocating for programs like EBT machines, farmers market incentive coupons, and just really being a voice in these climate action plans that cities do. Next slide. Meatless Monday, I mentioned, really has some great toolkits and tools on how you can implement that in cities, food policies, institutions, restaurants, workplace health, sustainability offices. So a lot of great resources and a great way to start if you haven't done, just like to enter in, and it's a very easy lift. And finally, many of you here are dietitians, or you might be working in the health field or be health professionals. And that's really, you have a great role to play in just advising on what on sustainable diets, knowing your community and the health issues that they might have and the nutrition issues facing it, translating the research out there. There's so much research that comes through. How do we translate that and really get clear steps and really adding that perspective and helping provide education within your policy, but also within your community. And then that's, just my last slide is just remembering that sustainable, healthy diets, cover a lot of areas. They have to be environmentally, ecologically sound, nutritionally viable, culturally acceptable, affordable, physically accessible, and socially just. And so it's a great, just keep these things in mind as we go forward. So that's all I have. And then I have a few resources there, but those are all in your packet. Thanks.
Thank you, Becky and Brent, for those wonderful overviews and kind of taking us from this macro perspective and kind of our production system and food systems, Becky, down to kind of the choices of diets that we eat and where our food comes from and how it's produced. So I love the weaving and connections. We're going to transition now to some examples from our invited presenters that are with food policy councils about what they're doing locally within their communities to address climate change. Thank you all in the chat for sharing kind of what you're doing related to climate change with resiliency audits, climate action plans, trying to get food into disaster relief planning, food waste, and understanding better the relationship between food security and climate. So keep them coming. We have another question for you that will pop in the chat, kind of understanding a little bit more of what are the challenges that you're facing in working on climate change or elevating and making it a priority with your work in your communities. I saw one message from Kitty talking about just the defensiveness of people that eat meat and reducing it even when presented with the evidence. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Del Deschamps from Pasco County, Florida, and Christine Keene to talk about their work with a resiliency plan in Pasco County.
As we enter the topic and study of this issue today, we need to think of it in terms of the world as it is and the changes that are occurring, the challenges that are happening to us individually and as cultures. And I don't know that this was noted yet in our opening presentations, but it's increasingly clear that we've entered a new climate epoch, the Anthropocene, the human epoch, when human beings dominate the planet and have come to fundamentally change the planet itself, with climate change being the leading example, but not the only one. So we need to think about a new climate when we pose our questions about food and food policy. We also need to think about overpopulation, collapsing ecosystems and food systems. We need to think about the date palms in Iraq and the olive groves in the West Bank. We need to think about food shortages. We need to think about the breakdown in supply chain. We have to think about food insecurity, starvation. We need to think about Gaza and the Sudan and Ethiopia and the unhoused in America. We also need to think about rising authoritarianism and the loss of faith and trust in democracy. Food policy councils are predicated on democratic ideals, and those ideals are losing purchase in our country today. Curiously, this moment of crisis is one which calls for all people to be involved in a deeper level, not just with their immediate political decisions, but in all areas that affect their lives. For the most part, however, we continue to do things the way we did in the 20th century. It's not the 20th century anymore. We continue to support the industrial food system, shop at big box stores, we favor franchise businesses, we use chemical pesticides and fertilizers as though it was natural, we order online, we maintain residential lawns, we love theme parks, plastic bags at grocery stores, buying mangoes from Mexico in the Florida mango season. It's convenient, easy, and cheap. Wendell Berry, who was invoked earlier, will be invoked again here. He said, "For 2 generations, we have had the costly privilege of living thoughtlessly about the sources of our life. And we've been able to do so, live in ignorance of the sources of our existence, precisely because of the way we've constructed the culture, a culture that privileges consumption, convenience, and the dominance of industrial global systems over the sources of our existence, and the marginalization and disempowerment and the destruction of local cultures and ecosystems that maintain and enrich those sources." So as we enter into the study of food systems in the context of today's world and the policies that we might implement, we enter fully aware of the powers that be that may impede our work, but must never be allowed to dissuade us. That being said, how do we begin? First, food policies are principles and ideals that guide action to achieve specific goals related to the food system and serve as the basis for implementing those actions by individuals or communities pursuing those goals. This fact is followed by the equally important reality of what is happening in the absence of food policy. In the absence of specific food policy, the de facto policy of an individual or community is the policy established by the dominant social institutions with cultural power in that area, or otherwise, the general norms within a culture's plausibility structure. So this is where we begin. Most of us live in a food policy wasteland. We have no explicit personal food policy. We have no local food policy, no municipal, county, state, or national food policy, despite all the well-meaning efforts of people that serve on these food policy councils. That being the case, then, what is the de facto policy? The de facto policy is one established by the dominant social institutions with cultural power in that area. that establish the general norms within a culture's plausibility structure. In the case of food, that would be agribusiness, the industrial food system, the global food system, the market-based distribution network based on the dominant economic model, cultural capitalism and economic capitalism. Does anyone know the gross sales of the corporate grocery stores in their community? How would you get that information? Why does it matter? Our work in the Pasco County Food Policy Council has always struggled with the challenges of operationalizing the ideals of sustainable and resilient food production based on principles of food sovereignty and localization of food production. We have had some successes, which have been largely rhetorical and cosmetic. Perhaps the two most notable successes have been, one, the drafting of the first ever food system assessment for the county. I have it right here. And the second is adding food security to the resiliency plan of our regional planning organization, the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. The latter success is an example of a direct response to the ecologic crisis and specifically climate change, focused on what the food system is and can be in the face of these challenges. Kristen, I don't know if you have the slide of the actual content of the food system feature of the resiliency plan, but if you do, you can put it up.
Yeah, I don't, but just as a heads up too, we only have a couple minutes, so.
Notably, before Pasco Food Policy Council took up the issue, the resiliency plan was silent on local food systems and seemed oblivious to the role of the food system in resiliency planning and the overall well-being of the community. We succeeded in our work for three key reasons. First, the council was politically and governmentally literate. We followed the work of Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, our county commission, and local municipal governments. We knew how to make sense of the documents that were presented to us. We received and studied the resiliency plan and pinpointed the glaring omission of the food system from the plan. We knew how to read it and we knew what it meant. Our council included, number two, our council included local professionals as well as county staff familiar with the food system who recognized the fragility and dominance by global industrial agribusiness and could articulate the peril of this fragility in the face of climate change and catastrophic weather events and how resilience could be developed. Third and final point, the council drafted a resolution for both the Pasco County Commission and the city council of the largest city in the county, Newport Richey. We presented the complete resolution to both bodies, each with representatives on Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. Each body accepted the resolution, adopted it, and both brought the resolution to the Planning Council where it was approved and added to the plan. Score one for Food Policy Council. We won that one, but we're still far behind, and it's the ninth inning. This is an example of how such responses can be developed. Each of those three features was necessary, and absent any one, the proposal would likely have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Del. I appreciate the context and for sharing about Pasco County. Up next, we have Jenny with Missoula, or with the Farm Connect Montana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to start by giving just a little background of our Food Policy Council and the structure in which we have to do our work and do our work. So we are an advisory board to both the city council and the county commissioners of Missoula County in Montana. I also have to mention, so the organization that I work for, Farm Connect Montana, that was founded about 20 years ago, was originally founded coming out of a community food assessment, just like the one that Del just held up on the screen. So we were created out of a large countywide community food assessment. And we very much so looked like a food policy council way back in 2004. We turned into a nonprofit, but a nod to that history is when the new Food Policy Council that I sit on today, that started in 2021, was created. We as an organization have a standing representative seat on that council. And our mission is to train and educate beginning farmers and ranchers, to make local food accessible to all Montanans, and farmland conservation. So those are our three priorities and what we sort of bring to the Food Policy Council, and expertise and a little bit of staff time. So we are an advisory board to the city and county, like I said, and so a very narrow place in which we work is providing policy recommendations either in letter form or verbally, showing up to meetings and attending when there is something food and agriculture related at a public meeting. We can also work with the county or city if there is funding available that could be given to or a pass through from the city or county that could be given to NGOs working in the food and agricultural sector. And we can also provide feedback and input for grants that are to the city and county that may impact climate, food, and agriculture within the service area that we work in. So those are the three main ways in which we, as an advisory board and Food Policy Council, interact with our city and county government. So I want to dive right into specific examples of things that we've worked on in hopes that some of you on the call today might be able to take some of these ideas and bring them home with you. And definitely open to connecting with any of you if you have any further questions about more details of any of the processes, but I'm going to do everything at a pretty high level. So first and foremost, one of the biggest issues that we have been facing in Missoula County and which is faced in a lot of other parts of the country, is high development pressure. We have a lot of people moving to Montana. Missoula, the Missoula city and county is growing in population. There's a lot more people to feed. There's a lot more land being developed. And working with the farmers that we do at Farm Connect Montana, there are a lot of smaller scale, diversified vegetable farms that provide a large amount of our local food and produce to our urban centers in the county. And with higher land prices and land access barriers and issues because of the affordability of land, what the council was given as an issue to work with city and county on is the conservation and protection of smaller agricultural land parcels around the urban centers in our county, and protecting that local food source, that really important prime agricultural soil that is quickly being developed upon. And looking to the local land trusts, which are usually the key players who protect land both for agriculture and for other environmental impact purposes. They are inundated with really large projects, right? So our little farmland projects, we're talking 10 to 100 acres, just are not being protected. You know, the land trusts don't have the capacity to protect those parcels with a conservation easement. And so there is another tool, a conservation tool to be used in Montana called a conservation servitude. It's a terrible, terrible name, but that is the legal name for it. It does look like a deed restriction. So this means that if you are a landowner and you want to protect your agricultural land and you enter into a conservation servitude, the document itself looks a lot like a conservation easement. You do not receive a tax benefit for doing that. What it looks like is a deed restriction that restricts development on your agricultural land, keeping your land in agriculture, maybe making it more affordable for a beginning farmer or rancher to access that land because it has been protected and cannot be developed. And if you ever wanted to change the terms of that servitude agreement, or you ever wanted to terminate it, how we are working with the county is coming out in support of them being a party on the servitude document. So the landowner, the county, and Farm Connect Montana, who's the NGO here, would all have to agree to terminate that document. So this is a pretty big deal because it's a brand new tool that has not been used in the state of Montana for agricultural land. And if it has, in very few places, and we haven't really found a great example yet. And so we're sort of needing to do a lot of education and support as a food policy council to our county commissioners so they can understand this tool, understand what the county's role can be in providing a new tool outside of the conservation for learners to use to protect their small ag land parcels. So that is one of the biggest pieces of work that we are, and the biggest issue, and that we're trying to find a solution for within our county, is protecting our small farms that are around the urban centers in our county. This relationship was able to start because another way in which our Food Policy Council was working alongside the county and protecting agricultural land was being a part of the zoning process. So if your county has a zoning process, we were the voice for local food and agriculture. And through that process, that resulted in some I don't know, zoning isn't actually a regulation, but it's basically in the plan. It talks a lot about landowner incentives for clustering development on larger agricultural parcels, and if you're able to get that incentive to cluster development in a quarter of your property, by getting that incentive and by taking advantage of that, that also means that then the rest of your land will have to be put under some sort of conservation tool. And so the Food Policy Council was really instrumental in having that now be a part of our zoning code. So that's another example of how the Food Policy Council works within this area. Let's see. I wanted to talk really quickly back to what Becky was talking about a climate-friendly diet, because we do also work with the county jail and the county school system on their procurement of local food policies. That's another big part of what we do, trying to change where they get their local food sourcing from as schools and other bigger institutions in the county. And along with that, we found that local food processing, a lot of those bigger facilities need the local food to come in already cut up and processed, which is like a huge barrier that we've been finding. And so we don't have a lot of local food processors for vegetables in Montana or in our county. So how are we working with the county to receive grant funding? How are we, working with them on maybe a budget line that can offer some local food processing, or even just barriers to maybe developing that kind of infrastructure within the county with the health department, let's say. Just there's a lot of policy work that could be done around local food processing needs, if that's also a barrier to larger institutions within your county to be using local food. And let's see, I just want to make sure that I covered everything. So there are also, back to conservation, a lot of really unique partnerships happening within the county. And if your county has open space bond funds or other pots of money that could be directed to protect local agriculture, that's another way in which you can get involved in that process, like write letters of recommendation to be sure that those funds can be released for those really creative agricultural protection projects. Okay, I think I'm out of time. So if anyone wants to contact me after about some of this stuff is pretty technical when it comes to conservation, and I use maybe some jargony words, but happy to talk to anybody who's on the call today more in depth.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It was great to hear about the relationship between your organization and working with the government, about the conservation servitude, which I agree is a terrible name, but it's a great intent and purpose and support for those that are growing fruits and vegetables. So thank you for sharing all that's happening in Montana. And then up last is Maddie Chera with the Greater Cincinnati Regional Food Policy Council. And Maddie, yes, a few more minutes for you because we're running behind, so not a problem. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie, as Karen said, and I'm the director of the Greater Cincinnati Regional Food Policy Council. We are based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I think this was shared in the intro at the top of the hour that we have a 10-county footprint that serves parts of Ohio Indiana, and Northern Kentucky. So we're sort of tri-state and have a regional scope. And part of the reason I explain that is to kind of give you a little context for what I'm about to share, but also because I think that our regional scope and our focus on regional and local policy and implementation is part of kind of defining our approach to climate action and climate policy where we're situated. So in addition to being regional, we also, our Food Policy Council operates under a collective impact model, and some of you might be familiar with that. Some of you might not. It's a special term, but it's very easy to understand what it really means, which is that people and organizations come together to work on shared goals with shared metrics, clear communication, backbone support for admin type things, and activities that are all aimed at the same goal. So that kind of distributed leadership and shared collective impact effort also shapes a lot of what we do. And then a couple other things that I think are important to kind of keep in mind when I talk about some examples of things we've done is that not all food policy councils are housed in a nonprofit organization, but ours is. So we are part of Green Umbrella, which you'll see in my background. Green Umbrella is a 501c3 that has that same regional scope and that collective impact model, but it's focused on a bunch of other environmental and community sort of well-being issues. So food is among the issues that Green Umbrella works on. And Green Umbrella actually recently became the Regional Climate Collaborative, which kind of like Food Policy Councils is sort of a model that is different place to place, but like a Food Policy Council brings people and organizations together to collaborate on climate action and climate policy. So our location and our mission and outlook kind of really orient how we approach climate issues, but I think that we also have a really special function having the Food Policy Council in this climate organization, because food, as we all know, connects these like long-term global concerns that we have about climate and the environment, as well as those everyday experiences of sharing meals or needing food access or meeting our needs. So anyway, without more background, I'll just kind of get into a few examples of what we've done, knowing that there's a lot more to share, and I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A or offline, and you also have the guide to refer to. But some of the things that our Food Policy Council has done is join in on campaigns and coalitions that kind of extend and amplify our capacity and our reach to work on climate change. So we've been involved in some work of the REAMP network, which serves like I think 10 states across the Midwest. So we were part of an action team last year that focused on food policy councils working on climate plans and climate action. And this year we're part of an action team working with the REAMP network on urban food systems resource sharing. So finding funding to help implement and plan some of these activities around climate and urban agriculture and things like that. We've also joined forces frequently with one of our statewide organizations focused on climate and food here, which is the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association. They're a member of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and we recently helped them create a guide for candidates for office, elected office, to ask them about a battery of questions related to our priorities around food and farming. And this is aimed at federal candidates for federal office, but there's a toolkit in addition to the questionnaire that we helped develop so that any member of our Food Policy Council or any of you actually could use it to adapt to your local and state candidates. We also did a lot of work, especially last year, advocating around our priorities for the Farm Bill, which still hasn't passed yet, but we continue to kind of work on those priorities that relate to climate change. So we created a bunch of resources, including videos, webinars, and train the trainer events. We joined with the statewide and national organizations. We did a letter and postcard writing campaign, and we held other events to kind of activate around the Farm Bill and educate what it even is and what our opportunities to kind of pair our climate goals and priorities with our nutrition goals and priorities and a bunch of other things. And then the last thing that I'll just mention really quickly, and again, I have so many more things I want to share, but I would like to get into the Q&A, is that like some of you have mentioned either in the chat or in the preceding comments, we've been kind of activating around planning processes at both the local and the regional level. So our Food Policy Council has been a collaborator in our city's Green Cincinnati plan for the past several rounds that has happened in 5-year increments. And food is a section within that plan, and we kind of activate around the process of the planning as well as championing some of the goals set there. But we also are part of, right now, our region has a EPA grant, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, planning grant to do a regional climate action plan. And I am the only member of the steering committee that is focused on food, but at least we have one person. So I try to kind of be the liaison and bring food priorities and food system priorities into those conversations. So the kind of information that we heard at the top of today's session is really important. And I think that some of my colleagues that are working on climate action planning in transportation or energy don't always think of food as a really important piece of this puzzle. And so I'm really excited to be able to utilize the resources that we've discussed and are launching today to kind of support that work. So please reach out to me if you want to discuss further. I think I'll hand it back to you, Karen, and we can get into the Q&A.
Thanks, Maddie. And we'll be sharing everyone's email address after in the slides and with folks that have registered as well, so people can reach out to you. And I think a great point in wrapping it up and bringing it back around to the absence of food and kind of thoughts and around climate change and what has an impact on climate change, and also in disaster relief as well. So, so we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And so if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or please, you're also welcome to put it in the Q&A box or in the chat, whichever is easiest. We have a question for Jenny that's in the Q&A right now. And the question is, can you talk more about the collaboration of the county, landowner, and NGO to terminate that specific document you mentioned, and what you are working on to utilize instead?
Yes. So I'm not sure if I want to try to be. So these documents are extremely technical. It looks like a conservation easement. And that's what we originally brought to the county to ask, is the county willing to hold a conservation easement? And there's a lot of transaction costs and appraisal costs and a lot of things that go along with working with a landowner to conserve your property for the long term, and then also stewarding that property in perpetuity forever, right? So for the county to sign on with a responsibility by themselves for an easement and all the requirements that come from the federal government as well to be a holder of an easement, we started to look at other tools to combat this small agricultural land issue. So this tool is very much so like an easement, but a little different in that it can be entered into by multiple parties. So instead of the accountability really being held between the landowner, the property, and the federal government, we had to find that other level of protection for this type of document within our community. So we are gaining the support of the county to be one of those entities, the landowner, and Farm Connect Montana. And the Food Policy Council is supporting this process. So that those 3 entities would need to agree to termination if a new landowner purchased that property, made a really good argument that affordable housing needed to go there instead of agricultural land when we're 50 years in the future, is basically what an example would be, where we would all have to come together and have that termination discussion, and also any amendments to that document. So that's sort of like where the protection actually happens of the land. But it also looks like a deed restriction, if you're familiar with that. So does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks, Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
We have a hand that's raised. And so Christine, I'm gonna unmute you and allow you to talk if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, thanks. So we're in Massachusetts, and in our area in the South Coast, we don't have many small or mid-sized processors for both farmers and fishermen. It is one of the areas that we have a huge gap in our area for. For any of the food policy councils here or collaboratives here, how did you get the infrastructure going for mid-sized and small processors to help with that gap area for procuring local food? Because that's the #1 thing. We're trying to get more of the schools and institutions to buy more local food, and that's just been a huge barrier. So if you have any thoughts on that, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I guess one of the ways that we worked, and this is state dependent, but our state had large processing grants that were available to municipalities, working with partners, working with agricultural producers. So we really, as a Food Policy Council, the one small action that we could do was write a letter of support, show up to ask the county to be going for this funding for Missoula County. So that is just one small way I think that made biggest impact, because then grants were written and county grant staff capacity was given, which is a big deal, and things like that.
This is kind of top of mind for me today because we just had a visit from some evaluators this morning, working with USDA to get feedback on the local food promotion program, which our Food Policy Council and some partners had the grant through that program in 2017. So actually before I even worked or lived in Cincinnati. So it was hard for me to reflect feedback from the grant, but I was listening to partners today, hearing them recall what we did. And basically we used that grant to support some kind of really small scale food hubs to really level up and build their capacity. So paid for them to rent a incubator kitchen space, paid for some of their other like transportation needs, and for GAP and other like food safety training and auditing that they needed. And so I think that leveraging some of those grants, I know there's also a lot of USDA money coming through state cooperative agreements or state ag agencies. So the Regional Food System Infrastructure program is another one that might be able to help with building capacity for the things you're describing. And then there's just a recent big announcement that they'll be continuing to increase funding for the LFPA, which is states have to opt into that cooperative agreement and then administer the funding. But those programs and like local food for schools and some of the other programs that states are going to be getting a lot of money to serve, food banks and schools and early care and education. I think, working together with other partners across your state to get the state ready to utilize and ask for those funds and then implement those programs would be suggestions I would maybe make. I'm sure you're already working on some of those, but those are things that come to my mind.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie and Jenny. So we have another question, and the question is, how many, if any, paid staff do you have working on climate change or on your priorities of your council? Our Food Policy Council is volunteer-based, and there's only so much time and talent that we can ask for folks, which is hard to move forward more intensive policies. Kristen or Del, do you guys want to start with how many staff you all have for paid staff you have for your council?
Yeah, so the way that our council is currently set up, there's a staff position in long range planning. And that planner, it used to be my role. That planner is actually supposed to be the staff liaison between the Food Policy Advisory Council and the county, is how it works. Our Food Policy Advisory Council is an official committee from our county commissioners. So we actually have to abide by sunshine laws and things like that. But it is very difficult to find a good place in county government for food policy to sit. So we are kind of struggling with that right now. So in a way, it makes sense for it to be in planning, right, in development services and long range planning. But yet the directors and those above are saying, well, this really is more like community development or community services. There's extension offices. It doesn't plug in well anywhere. So because it doesn't plug in well, it's hard for other people to see value in it in the time that it takes to really do things. So we have a great council with a lot of good people involved from different local agencies and growers, but it's hard to pick up traction and move forward.
We have 2 full-time staff working to serve our Food Policy Council, but we also have a lot of other projects that go beyond kind of some of the policy and planning things that we've discussed today. So even though I feel lucky to have 2 paid staff, it doesn't feel like enough, but yeah, it definitely helps to have some people whose job and focus is to do some of these activities.
The other reason Farm Connect Montana was roped into, not roped in, we love being on it, obviously, because of our mission, but into this Food Policy Council was to provide staff support. So a lot of the letters of recommendation, our nonprofit helps to draft based on the conversation that happened. And we do a lot of research. We do a lot of bringing to the Food Policy Council projects to move forward, things like that. Because, and very similar to the other county-based Food Policy Council, we were in Parks, Trails, and Open Lands. Now we've been moved to the Extension Office. So we are also kind of being moved around. We do get staff support, but very little staff support. So the nonprofit commitment and building that into the structure of the Food Policy Council is where a lot of the staff capacity comes from as well.
Thank you all. We're just about at time, and so I just wanted to give everyone at least one more word. If you were going to share some word of advice or encouragement for groups working on climate change with their councils, what would that one very brief word of advice be?
Patience.
Mine would totally be collaboration.
Yeah, I echo Kristen. I think it's collaboration, coalition. Try to align. Alignment's the one I'll add.
Del or Brent, do you have a word of advice to share?
Yeah, money. Food policy councils, as we've seen probably in our short presentations here, we're underfunded. We tend to be ignored, disrespected by the powers that be in our culture. These systems work with money and resources, and where the money goes is where the interest is. And I've seen over working on these types of projects for 40 years and really intensely for the last 20 or so is the ability to develop resources within the community to support it, meaning municipal government, county government, even state government for these types of projects are minimal. So get the money.
Thank you. Brent, do you have anything to add?
I don't know if I can distill it down to one word. Maybe just meeting people where they're at. Understanding why the people eat what they eat, why we farm what we farm.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for being here today. We will share slides, the recording, and the resource guide with everyone that registered. We really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom. So thank you all for joining us.